Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. You're listening to Hassan Estakhrian's Rules of a Machine from A Year of Deep Listening. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Armacanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. Today, I'm joined by sound and media artist and director of the Center for Deep Listening, Stephanie Loveless, to talk about the new book, A Year of Deep Listening, 365 Tech Scores for Pauline Oliveros. A Year of Deep Listening was initiated as a 365-day online celebration of the legacy of Pauline Oliveros, coinciding with what would have been her 90th birthday. The Center for Deep Listening, established at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in 2014, posted one tech score per day, totaling 365 pieces, which will be published in book form on January 28, 2025, edited by Stephanie Loveless. Thanks for joining me, Stephanie.
Thank you.
To start off, what is the Center for Deep Listening?
The Center for Deep Listening is housed in Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is where Pauline Oliveros taught for the last 15 years of her life. And she moved much of her work and archives and legacy from what was then the Deep Listening Institute to become the Center for Deep Listening at Rensselaer in 2014. And what we do at the center is we steward the practice and the community of deep listening, and we teach deep listening and teach future teachers of deep listening.
Let's take a step back, and can you tell us what is deep listening, and maybe talk about the influence of Pauline Oliveros' work on 20th century music and later generations of composers?
Yes, sure. What is deep listening? So deep listening is something that, in a way, can't be defined in just a few sentences. It is really a practice to be experienced. And I think this is also why Pauline Oliveros defined it in multiple different ways that are all similar but different across different writings. So sometimes she would say that it is the practice of remembering to listen to everything that it is possible to hear in every possible way, and to remind yourself when you're not listening. So it's a practice of, I sometimes call it a practice of sonic and more than sonic awareness and attention. And it expresses itself through sort of listening techniques and meditations and scores or exercises that people can practice alone or more often together with others.
People may be familiar with her sonic meditations.
Yeah, so early on, as she was sort of developing, or even you might say workshopping this practice, which she workshopped with a group of female identified people that she called the Women's Ensemble. And they worked together for more than a year on listening, collective listening practices. And eventually, Pauline notated them in word form and put it out as a short collection of instruction scores or text scores that are called the Sonic Meditations.
Could you talk about your own interactions with Oliveros and your interactions with deep listening?
Sure. So I encountered Pauline Oliveros and deep listening. I found out that she existed and this practice existed, and that deep listening retreats were held and led by Pauline Oliveros along with her partner, Ione, a sort of a keeper of dreams, somebody who focused on listening in dreams. And also co-taught with Eloise Gold, who focused on and still focuses on listening through the body and through movement. So I found out about these retreats in 2005, and I did two deep listening retreats in New Mexico with Pauline Oliveros and Ione and Eloise Gold. And I believe it was at my second retreat that I was talking with Pauline about how I was planning to apply to grad school. And she suggested that I apply to RPI, where she was then teaching. And I did. And so then I went there and worked with her there. After I graduated, I moved from upstate New York down to New York City. And when I moved back to the area in 2014, she invited me to come and begin teaching deep listening courses at RPI, first in the summer. And then that just developed into a full-time position and eventually the directorship of the center.
There's become a community of composers and music makers around Pauline Oliveros and this idea of deep listening, people who've studied with her. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Deep listening really is, I believe, a community practice, right? It's something that's generally practiced, these listening exercises, these sounding scores, these creative exercises are most often performed in company with others. I should mention for folks that are not familiar with her work that one of its key features is that these scores are designed to be accessible to people of all musical ability and lack of ability. So they don't require the ability to read music, obviously, because they're notated in words. They don't require any particular instruments or ability to hit certain notes. So it's very much of a community-oriented practice. And so I think that community tends to develop around deep listening for that reason. But also, Pauline, as a person, she was very well known and well respected in her field, but she was so incredibly accessible. I am constantly in my position as director of the Center for Deep Listening, will have people come up to me and say, "Oh, it was amazing. I was just like some student in my first year of undergrad starting to learn about composition. And, I reached out to Pauline and she wrote back and then we would have these exchanges. And the thing is that she was like that with everybody. She had seemingly endless energy and generosity. And she cared so much about fostering and supporting young composers. And of course, as a performer, she was also an improviser and collaborator. So she just ended up creating so much community around her through her mentorship, through her musical relationships, and through her teaching as well, teaching at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, teaching workshops all around the world.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Seth Kluwett's piece from A Year of Deep Listening, No Small Matter, performed by Extradition. How did the idea for the original online version of A Year of Deep Listening come about?
That kind of came about in company as well. I was in a meeting with the advisory board of the Center for Deep Listening, and this idea that we maybe ought to mark what would have been Pauline's 90th birthday emerged, and then there was some idea of, maybe we could like declare a day and like do something on that day. And then somehow that turned into no, not a day, but every day. And so then this idea emerged to put out a public call for people who have been moved by Pauline Oliveros's work or by deep listening and, who wanted to offer a score in her honor. And so, we collected those and yeah, we published one a day for the full year starting on what would have been her 90th birthday to her 91st.
And it's now being published as a book. So are you hoping that these will be more widely performed as a collection, or what's the goal of the publication now?
One of the things that I talk about in the introduction to the book was how when Pauline Oliveros passed, she left a kind of a huge rift or gap seemingly in the fabric of the universe for those of us who knew her or worked with her or admired her. But then that it began to feel like maybe she was just now kind of distributed. And so that was kind of the spirit with which I embarked on this project. And that and this idea of amplifying all of these voices that were inspired by her, because some of them, really have no need of further amplification. They're wonderful and they're to be celebrated, but they are world touring or prize winning composers, but others don't identify as professional artists or musicians in any way. And they just contributed scores anyway. And so I really love having all of these scores kind of on the same playing field. And indeed, so this publication as a book is just for me a way to like further amplify and extend I guess, the life of the project, but more the seeds of all of these scores.
Who are some of the composers who wrote pieces for this project? Are there names that listeners might recognize or pieces that you felt really stood out?
I mean, I love so many of the pieces. I have to say that this whole project has been the biggest labor of love that I have ever been a part of. It has been just such a joy and an honor to be with all of the scores. Like I've got to spend a lot of time with all of them. And there are over 300 different contributors. And so, I'm just going to look through the contributors page here. Alan Cortez is a well-known Argentinian composer. Anea Lockwood is a wonderful composer and sound artist who's been incredibly inspiring. There's artists from all over the world. C. Lavender or Lavender Suarez wrote a really beautiful book called Transcendent Waves, I believe, inspired in part by deep listening.
Would you read the text for a couple of these?
Sure. Gosh, but there's just like so many. I was only at the like, C's or D's. When I was organizing or curating the book as a book, one of the things that I did was just sort of look at the different themes that seem to emerge or orientations toward listening. And so it's broken up sort of into chapters. So this score by Karen Werner is called Buzz and Breath Duet. It is in the Listening to Ourselves section. Listen to the buzz in your ears, in the room, and listen to the exhale of your breath as a duet. And I really love that one. So it's so simple.
Thanks. Yeah.
And this one is from the relational listening section by Corey Reeder. It's called They Tell Each Other Stories. How does many form one? I don't think it is by always sounding together. It is by giving space, perhaps not playing at all. Did you hear their sound? Perhaps if we start simply, only a single tone here and there. Lots of silence, listening, gradually building. In general, long tones. Occasionally a gesture, perhaps only two tones. Perhaps no longer silent or even quiet. Flowering and decaying tones, faintly pulsing tones, echoing tones. After some time we return, listening. A long sustained tone here and there. Always somewhere in between, forming and disappearing of the self into another. Okay, this one's very short. This is Cloud by Joe Hayes. Find a cloud. Follow it for as long or as far as you can. Listen so closely, you begin to hear it move through the air.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Grace Harper's piece from A Year of Deep Listening, Water, Wood, Stone, Breath, performed by Extradition.
If anybody can the ecstasy define, half the transport, half the trouble, with which flowers humble bloom, anybody find the fountain from which floods so contraflow. I will give him all the daisies, which among the hillside grow. Too much pathos in their faces for a simple breast like mine. Butterflies from St. Domingo, cruising around the purple line, have a system of aesthetics far superior to mine. Parents could not lay
You mentioned as part of your editing process that you've grouped these scores based on their themes. Could you talk about that process and what the different groupings are?
Yeah, so I put the scores into different sections partly as a way to make the book more readable, right? Because for the online project, everyone would kind of receive or see one score per day. In this case, I felt that just having 365 scores boom together in a single book, one might get a little bit lost, right? So it was just a way of kind of wayfinding through the book. And the general themes that emerged for me as I was spending time with the scores was scores for listening to oneself, scores for listening with others or to others, like relational listening. Then there was scores that were sort of like listening to the surroundings, like the built environment or in the built environment. Then there were scores that seemed to be more about listening with land or natural elements in our surroundings. There were scores, many scores about listening with other species, sort of multi-species listening. There were scores that seemed to be specifically pointing to listening with the body, scores about listening in or in relation to dreams or imagination. And then there were scores that I gathered a bunch of scores together under the heading of playful listening. So those are just kind of scores that are playful in that sense, but also scores that really kind of reference music. So there's no notated scores here. They're all text scores. They're all accessible, but some of them were clearly made specifically for ensembles, or maybe they, reference musical ideas or instruments in some way, usually kind of turning it a little bit on its side, but kind of referencing that world. And then there were scores that I brought together under the heading of scores for gratitude, grief, and healing, because that was also a really strong theme.
I think it's wonderful that you've collected these all in one place that'll be accessible to a wider group of people. So thank you for doing that service. And full disclosure, I also have a piece in the book, so I'm really happy to have been able to take part in the project.
Indeed. Shall I read your score?
Sure.
I have to find it, though. Yes. Do you have just one score? Do you have more than one, actually?
Well, I have one that's under my name and then one that's under Ensemble Decipher's name.
I got it. So this is Ensemble Decipher's Planned for Obsolescence. Find a piece of technology that you have replaced with something newer but still keep around. A cell phone, a TV, a toaster, a blender. Turn it on. What sounds does it make? Sing or hum a drone. Why did you replace it? Imitate the sounds of the device vocally. Why did you keep it? Improvise with it in a duet. Turn off the device and stop vocalizing.
Yeah, we had fun putting that one together.
And oh, this one is yours, Ancestors?
Yes.
Oh, that's so beautiful. This one is in the gratitude, grief, and healing section. Sit alone or in a group. Recall a sound memory inherited from your ancestors. Listen to it mentally. Begin to vocalize a few seconds of your sound memory repeatedly. Gradually vocalize more and more of your memory and find harmony with the sounds around you. When the time is right, stop and listen to the remaining memories. Feel those who came before you. You know, I just want to say that many of the scores that kind of deal with ancestry or memories of those that are no longer with us, or with grief, healing, these things felt so important to me and really hold a special place in my heart. And I think it's both because, of course, this book is a love letter and a tribute and an honorific to Pauline Oliveros, who's not on Earth anymore and who many of us miss very much, but also because it seems like in this particular moment that, you know, we're needing to figure out how to deal with a lot of grief and a lot of pain. And so I'm really grateful to all those scores that can help us listen differently or generatively or in a way that honors and makes space for that.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you. Where can people find the book, which, as we mentioned, will be out on January 28th?
The book is being distributed through MIT Press via Random House, and so it should be widely available. It may or may not be in a bookstore near you, but anyone in the States and Canada at least can go to bookshop.org. They're really great, and it's a way of having the book ordered through your local bookstore, and then it will be at a bookstore near you.
Oh, thank you for talking with me about a year of deep listening. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds in San Francisco. We'll be back soon for interviews with the composers of Other Minds Festival 29, October 16th through 19th, 2025, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.